and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. My father and I hunt deer during the fall, and we have always processed our own harvest at home. It is something we have done for years. We do not treat it casually, and we do not waste what we take. Once the meat is processed and packed away, there are always remains left over that cannot be used. For those, we have a place deep in the woods, far away from neighbors, roads, and houses. It is not somewhere you would find by accident. You have to know the trails. You have to know where the land changes from familiar woods into the deeper, quieter part of the property. There are no lights out there, no clear paths once you get far enough in, and no sound except wind moving through the trees, birds, and whatever animals happen to be nearby. That is where we leave the remains and let nature take its course. For years, I never gave it much thought. Nature is efficient. There are coyotes, foxes, vultures, raccoons, crows, stray dogs, and all kinds of smaller animals in the woods. Something always finds food eventually. By the time we came back to that part of the forest, there was usually nothing left to see. Still, one thing always seemed strange to me. You would think bones would pile up over time. Even if scavengers carried off most of the meat, there should have been something. A skull, a rib, leg bones, antlers from an older buck. Something that proved the animals had ever been left there. But there never was. Every time we went back to that area, it looked almost untouched. There were leaves, branches, old moss-covered logs, damp soil, and the usual mess of the woods. But there were no bones scattered around, no old remains, no obvious signs of animals feeding, nothing that made it look like a place where carcasses had been left over the years. My dad always had a simple explanation. Nature cleans up, he would say. And he was probably right. There are plenty of things in the woods that can drag off a carcass, chew through bone, scatter remains, or carry pieces away. A deer left in the right place can disappear quickly if enough animals find it. But I was curious. I wanted to know exactly what was doing it. I wanted to see whether it was coyotes, bears, vultures, or something else. I had heard stories from people who set up trail cameras and captured all kinds of things. Bobcats slipping through the dark, foxes standing on fallen trees, coyotes hunting in packs, bears wandering through yards, deer staring directly into the lens like they somehow understood they were being watched. I figured it would be interesting to see what happened after we left. The next time we had remains to discard, I decided to set up a trail camera nearby. It was a simple motion-triggered camera, nothing expensive or professional. You strap it to a tree, angle it toward the area you want to watch, and let it take pictures whenever the sensor detects movement. The camera was set to take 3 pictures every time it was triggered. That way, if an animal walked through, I would not just get one blurred image. I would get a short sequence showing what it was doing. If a coyote came in, I might get 3 shots of it approaching. If a raccoon found the remains, I might get it sniffing, then feeding, then looking directly at the camera. That was the idea anyway. I spent more time setting it up than I expected. The woods were quiet that day, but not peaceful. There is a difference. Quiet woods can feel calm when the sun is out and you can hear birds moving around. But deep woods, especially in fall, have a different kind of silence. The trees are thinner, the ground is covered in wet leaves, and every sound seems to travel farther than it should. A branch snapping somewhere off the trail makes you stop. A bird taking off from a low branch sounds larger than it is. Even the sound of your own boots pushing through leaves can make you feel like someone is following behind you. I chose a tree a short distance away from the remains and strapped the camera around the trunk. I made sure the lens had a clear view. I tested it by walking in front of it a few times and checking for the small red indicator light. Everything seemed fine. I stepped back, looked at the setup one more time, and imagined what I would find. Maybe I would see a pack of coyotes arrive after midnight. Maybe a black bear would show up. Maybe it would be something boring, like crows and raccoons. Either way, I expected there would be an answer. Then, I left. For the next few days, I kept thinking about the camera. Not in a frightened way at first, mostly curiosity. Whenever I had a quiet moment, I wondered what might be on the SD card. I pictured dozens of pictures of animals coming and going. I wondered how quickly the scavengers would find the remains. I wondered whether they would approach cautiously or rush in all at once. After a few days, I went back into the woods to check the camera. I went alone. That was probably not a big deal. I knew the area, and it was daytime. But as I walked farther from the familiar parts of the property, I started feeling a little uneasy. It was one of those days where the light was flat and gray, with no real sunlight coming through the trees. The forest floor was wet. The leaves had been pressed down by rain. The air had that cold, damp smell that comes before winter settles in. As I got close to the area, I slowed down. I expected to see something. At minimum, I expected to see bones. Maybe scattered fur. Maybe disturbed leaves. Maybe signs of animals pulling at the remains. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing there. Nothing. The carcass was gone. Not mostly gone. Not picked apart. Gone, there was no skull, no spine, no leg bones, no ribs, no pieces of hide. No evidence that anything had been left in that spot at all. The ground did not look torn up. The leaves were not heavily disturbed. There were no obvious drag marks leading away. It looked like the entire thing had simply been removed from the woods. I remember standing there for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. I knew animals could carry away parts of a carcass. I knew coyotes could drag pieces off. I knew bears could move large amounts of weight easily. I knew smaller scavengers could reduce something faster than people realize. But the complete absence of anything felt strange. Even if an animal had taken the main body, something should have been left behind. There should have been a trace. I looked around the area. I checked behind nearby trees. I looked through the leaves. I followed the ground outward in different directions, looking for tracks or signs of something being dragged. There was nothing obvious. The camera was still on the tree. At least, that was a good sign. I walked over, checked it, and saw that it had taken a huge number of pictures. The small display showed that the memory card had been triggered repeatedly. I did not know exactly how many pictures were on it yet, but it was clear the camera had been active. That made me feel better. Maybe the answers were all on the card. Maybe the camera had caught coyotes dragging the remains away one piece at a time. Maybe there had been a bear. Maybe there had been several animals working together. I removed the SD card, made sure the camera was still secure, and headed back home. The walk out of the woods felt different from the walk in. I kept thinking about the empty spot. I tried to tell myself that it was normal. Nature had done what nature does. Maybe I had expected too much. Maybe I had watched too many trail camera videos and imagined there would be a dramatic explanation. But every time I thought about how clean the area looked, I felt unsettled again. Back home, I put the SD card into my computer. There were around 5,000 pictures on it. That number alone surprised me. 5,000 pictures in only a few days sounded like a lot, but motion cameras can be sensitive. Wind can move leaves. Branches can sway in front of the sensor. Changes in light can trigger them. Birds flying near the camera can set them off. A camera in the woods can take hundreds of useless shots without capturing a single animal. That was exactly what most of the pictures looked like. Leaves, darkness, the same patch of forest floor, the same tree trunks, a branch moving slightly in the wind. More leaves, nothing. I clicked through hundreds of them. Then more. The pictures were taken in groups of 3, just like the camera was set up to do. Sometimes the first image would show a leaf moving, the second would show it farther to the side, and the third would show the woods looking completely still again. Most of the nighttime pictures were nearly black. You could make out the area where the remains had been left, but only barely. The infrared mode gave the images a pale, washed-out look. The trees looked silver gray. The leaves looked like static on an old television. Shadows seemed to blend together. I started looking for animals. At first, I found nothing. No fox, no coyote, no bear, no raccoon, no birds, no deer, just thousands of images of the same empty space. That was strange enough on its own. I had expected at least one animal to appear. Even if nothing touched the remains, I thought something would eventually wander through the area. But the photos showed almost nothing except movement caused by wind. I kept scrolling. The first day looked normal. The carcass was there in the background of each image. It was dark, but visible enough that I could tell it was still in the same place. Then the second day came. Again, more wind-triggered photos. The remains were still there. The third day was similar. The light changed. Night turned to morning. Morning turned to afternoon. The woods looked exactly the same in every frame. Then I reached the part that made me stop. There was a 1-hour gap in the camera sequence. 1 hour with no pictures at all. At first, that did not seem impossible. Maybe nothing moved in front of the sensor. Maybe the wind died down. Maybe the woods were still for a while. But when I looked at the pictures before and after the gap, the difference was impossible to ignore. Before the gap, the carcass was there. After the gap, it was gone. Just gone. The first pictures before that missing hour showed the remains exactly where we had left them. Then the camera went silent. No 3-picture sequence. No blurry movement. No animal. No shadow. No person. Nothing. Then, 1 hour later, the camera began taking pictures again. And the spot was empty. I went back and checked the timestamps. Then I checked them again. The carcass was visible. Then there was a gap. Then there was nothing in its place. No gradual change, no series of coyotes feeding, no bear pulling it away, no vultures tearing at it, no animal dragging bones toward the trees. No evidence of anything happening at all. It looked like the camera had simply missed the entire event. The remains had disappeared during the only hour when the camera had taken no pictures. I stared at the screen for a long time. At first, I laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, more because it felt so ridiculous. I had set up a camera specifically to find out what took the remains, and the one moment I needed to see was the one moment the camera had nothing. I started thinking of practical explanations. Maybe the camera malfunctioned. Maybe the battery had dropped temporarily. Maybe the SD card had trouble writing files. Maybe the sensor failed. Maybe the camera had been blocked by something. Maybe an animal had bumped it or shifted the angle slightly. But the camera worked perfectly before and after that hour. It had thousands of useless pictures of leaves. It had no trouble capturing wind. It had no trouble capturing the empty clearing after the remains were gone. It just happened to stop recording during the exact period when something removed an entire carcass without leaving a trace. That was the part that bothered me. I did not expect the camera to show anything supernatural. I expected a normal answer. I expected the whole thing to be educational, maybe even a little boring. I thought I would learn that a few coyotes and scavengers could clean up much faster than I realized. Instead, I learned nothing, or at least nothing that made sense. I showed the pictures to my dad. He looked through some of them, then looked at the missing hour. He was not nearly as bothered as I was. He said it was probably coyotes, or maybe a bear. He pointed out that animals can move surprisingly fast when food is involved. A large predator could drag off the biggest pieces, and smaller animals could scatter the rest. The woods are full of things people never see. He was right. That is probably what happened. But I asked him where the bones went. I asked him why there were no drag marks. I asked him why the camera did not capture a single animal. He shrugged and said that cameras do strange things. That is also true. Trail cameras are not perfect. Sensors miss things. Weather affects them. Batteries weaken. A camera can capture nothing but branches for hours, then somehow miss a deer walking right through the middle of the frame. Still, it was hard to let go of. I kept going back to the images. I would zoom in on the last picture before the gap. The remains were there. I would zoom in on the first picture after. The ground was empty. The leaves looked almost the same. The trees were in the same place. The camera angle had not changed. Nothing looked disturbed enough to explain what happened. It was as if the forest had closed around the evidence. After that, my dad and I started joking about it. We said it was our backyard chupacabra. Sometimes we said it was Bigfoot. We would laugh and say that something huge lived deep in the woods, something smart enough to avoid trail cameras and patient enough to wait for the exact moment the sensor stopped working. It was mostly a joke. Mostly, but there are moments when I think about that camera and feel uncomfortable. Not because I truly believe a mythical creature took the remains. I do not. There are probably normal explanations that I just do not understand. Maybe a bear dragged everything off farther than I thought to look. Maybe several animals worked through the night. Maybe the camera's sensor had a dead spot. Maybe weather caused the gap. But there is something unsettling about being in the woods and realizing how little you actually see. You can walk through the same forest for years and think you know it. You know where the trails are. You know where the trees stand. You know where animals usually move. Then one day, you leave something in a clearing, set up a camera to watch it, and come back to find no trace that it was ever there. The woods do not explain themselves. They do not leave answers because you ask for them. They swallow sounds. They hide tracks. They cover disturbed ground with leaves and rain. They let animals move through spaces you thought were empty. And sometimes they take something away so completely that all you are left with is a 1-hour blank spot on a memory card. Even now, if I hear something moving deep in the trees near that area, I think about those pictures. I think about the last frame where the remains were still there. I think about the first frame where the ground was empty. And I think about whatever passed through the woods during that missing hour, careful enough, or lucky enough, not to leave a single image behind. When I was younger, around 5 years old, I had recurring dreams. They were not always nightmares exactly. Some of them were strange, some felt sad, and some were so ordinary that they would not have meant anything to anyone else. But they came back again and again, every few days, almost like my mind was replaying the same short scenes on a loop. Most of the dreams from that age have faded over time. I remember pieces of them, feelings more than details. I remember being afraid of certain rooms, certain shadows, and certain sounds, but one dream stayed with me much more clearly than the others. It was not scary. That was the strange part. There was no monster in it. No one chased me. Nobody got hurt. Nothing jumped out at me. It was just a simple, quiet scene that repeated itself so many times that it became familiar. In the dream, I was walking toward a house. The house sat in front of a hill. It was not a huge hill or a mountain. It was more of a grassy slope rising behind the house, with enough height to make the building stand out against it. The road in front of the house was quiet. There were no cars passing, no other people walking nearby. It felt like the house was somewhere rural, far away from the kind of neighborhood I knew as a child. I would walk up to the front door. Then, I would knock. Someone would answer, though I do not always remember seeing their face clearly. In some versions of the dream, I only remember a woman's voice. In others, I remember the door opening and someone standing there. But their face was never the important part. I would ask if I could have some wood for a campfire. The person would tell me to take it from the driveway. Then I would walk over to the side of the house, where there was a pile of firewood. I would gather some of it, or at least look at it, and then I would leave. That was the entire dream. House, hill, driveway, firewood, then walking away. It was so simple that I never understood why it came back so often. As a kid, I did not question it much. Children accept dreams in a way adults usually do not. You can dream about something completely random, wake up, and move on with your day without trying to find a reason for it. The dream would happen, I would wake up, and eventually I would forget about it until it came again a few days later. But because it repeated, certain details became fixed in my mind. I remembered the front of the house. I remembered the slope behind it. I remembered the driveway. I remembered the wood stacked there. I remembered the feeling of walking up to the door, knocking, and asking for something that felt important in the dream, even though it was only firewood. The house did not feel like my home. It did not look like anything near where I lived in Canada. It had a different kind of atmosphere. The road seemed narrower. The land around it felt older. The house itself had a style that did not match the homes I was used to seeing, though when I was 5, I could not have explained that clearly. I only knew it was not a place I recognized from real life. For a while, I had the dream every few days. Sometimes the details changed a little. The light outside might be different. Sometimes it seemed like late afternoon with pale sunlight on the hill. Sometimes it was overcast. Sometimes the house looked empty until I knocked. Sometimes I could hear distant voices or birds, but there was never anything threatening. The main part never changed. I always went to that house. I always asked for firewood. I always found it in the driveway. I always left. Then, eventually, the dreams stopped. They did not end with anything dramatic. There was no final version where something happened. There was no moment where I realized what the dream meant. I simply stopped having it. As I got older, I forgot about it. Not completely, but enough that it became one of those strange little memories from childhood that only appears once in a while. Maybe I would think about it after seeing a house on a hill or a stack of wood near someone's driveway. Maybe I would remember the general idea of it without being able to picture every detail. By the time I was a teenager, I barely thought about it at all. Then, when I was 14, I went on a trip to Europe. I live in Canada, and it was my first time traveling there. At that age, going to Europe felt enormous. It was not just a vacation. It felt like entering a completely different world. The cities, roads, houses, languages, food, and landscapes all seemed unfamiliar compared to what I knew at home. I went as part of a camp program. The camp was doing a trip that involved traveling down a river by boat for a week. It was the kind of trip where you had to carry what you needed, work with the people in your group, help set up camp, and get used to being outside for long stretches of time. It was exciting, but it was also exhausting. For a week, we traveled along the river, stopping at different places to rest, eat, and set up camp. There were long days of being on the water, paddling, carrying gear, and trying to stay organized. By the end of the week, everyone was tired in the way people get tired after spending days outside. Your clothes smell like smoke and river water. Your arms are sore. Your shoes are never completely dry. You start to miss ordinary things like a real shower, a bed, and a warm room. But it was still a good experience. The river passed through places that looked completely different from home. There were stretches of open land, sections lined with trees, small roads disappearing into the distance, and occasional houses that seemed isolated from everything else. After the week on the river was over, we settled in a clear area to camp. We needed firewood. I do not remember exactly how we decided who would go. It may have been that the counselors split us into small groups and told us to look for wood nearby. It may have been that a few of us volunteered because we were tired of sitting around and wanted to do something useful. Either way, I ended up being part of the group sent to find firewood. At first, we tried to look around the area where we had set up camp. There were branches and bits of wood nearby, but not enough. The ground around us had probably already been picked through, and most of the wood we found was either too wet, too small, or too rotten to burn properly. We walked farther out. There was a road near where we had settled, and we followed it for a while. We were supposed to be looking for fallen branches or some place where we could gather enough wood without causing problems. But after a while, we got lazy. We were teenagers. We had already spent a week outdoors. We did not want to drag wet branches back to camp or search the woods for another hour. We wanted an easy solution. So when we found a few houses in the middle of nowhere, someone suggested asking if they had spare firewood. It did not seem like a bad idea at the time. There were no stores nearby. We were in a rural area. People in places like that often had wood stacked outside their homes. It seemed possible that someone would be willing to give a group of tired campers a few pieces for a fire. We kept following the road. The houses were spread out, with space between them. The scenery was quiet. There were fields, trees, and low hills around us. It did not look like a place where many people passed through. The road itself felt older and narrower than roads back home, and the houses seemed built differently from the ones I knew in Canada. At first, I was only thinking about getting firewood. Then I started to feel strange. Not scared, just strange. It began as a feeling that I had seen the area before. That is not unusual on its own. Sometimes a place reminds you of somewhere else. A road can look like a road from your hometown. A hill can look like another hill. A house can resemble something you have passed before. But this did not feel like that. It felt more specific. As we walked, I noticed a hill in the distance behind one of the houses. The shape of it made something in my mind tighten. I slowed down. The others kept talking, but I was suddenly paying close attention to everything around me. The road, the grass, the way the house sat in front of the hill, the space near the driveway. I had seen it before, or at least I felt like I had. At first I told myself it was just familiar-looking scenery. I had been on the river for a week, surrounded by hills and rural land. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was starting to see patterns because we had been walking for a while. But the closer we got, the stronger the feeling became. The house in front of the hill looked exactly like the house from my childhood dream. Not generally similar, not kind of like it. It looked right. The shape of the building, the placement of the front door, the slope behind it, the driveway. Even the feeling of the place seemed familiar. I remember standing there with the others while my mind tried to catch up. For a moment, I did not say anything. I think part of me did not want to mention it because it sounded ridiculous. How could I tell a group of people that I had dreamed about this exact house when I was 5 years old? How could I explain that I had been having the same dream every few days as a child, then somehow ended up standing in front of that location years later in another country? I could barely explain it to myself. But I knew what I remembered. I had walked toward this house in my dream. I had knocked on this door. I had asked for firewood. I had been told to get it from the driveway. It was too exact. I felt like I had stepped into a memory that did not belong to my real life. The others were not thinking about any of that. They just wanted wood. Someone walked up to the house, or maybe I did. I cannot remember exactly which of us first approached the door, because by then I was so distracted by the feeling of recognition that everything seemed unreal. But I know I ended up at the door. I knocked. The door opened. A woman answered. And we asked if we could have some firewood. I remember trying to watch her face in the doorway at the same time, almost waiting for her to say something that would confirm the dream. Maybe I expected her to recognize me. Maybe I expected the moment to become obviously strange. But she was just a normal woman answering the door. She listened to what we asked. Then she pointed toward the driveway. She told us the firewood was there, the same place it had been in the dream. I remember standing there, staring toward the driveway. There was the wood, stacked exactly where I had expected it to be. I do not know whether it was arranged in the same way I remembered, because dreams are never that exact. But the location was right. The house was right. The hill was right. The driveway was right. The entire scene unfolded in the same order that it had in my recurring dream when I was 5. We gathered the wood. I probably helped carry it, though I barely remember doing so. My mind was somewhere else. I kept looking around, trying to find a difference. I wanted something to be wrong. I wanted there to be some obvious reason why the house looked familiar. Maybe there would be a sign I had seen in a photograph before. Maybe I would remember that my family had traveled through that part of Europe when I was little. Maybe one of the counselors would say something that explained it. Nothing did. It was just a house in a rural place. A woman had given us firewood. We walked away and returned to camp. For everyone else, it was probably one small part of the day. We needed wood. We found a house. Someone was kind enough to help. That was it. But for me, it felt completely different. I could not stop thinking about the dream. I remembered being 5 years old and walking toward a house in front of a hill. I remembered knocking. I remembered asking for campfire wood. I remembered being told that it was in the driveway. And then, almost 10 years later, I was 14 years old in Europe, doing exactly those things in real life. The strangest part was that it was not an important moment in my life. That is what makes it hard to understand. The dream was not about something dramatic. It was not a warning. It was not about danger. Nothing terrible happened at the house. Nothing supernatural happened once I got there. Nobody said anything mysterious. We did not discover some huge secret. It was just firewood. It was just a house. It was just a moment that should have been ordinary. But that was exactly why it unsettled me. If I had dreamed about a major event, maybe I could convince myself that it was my brain trying to prepare me for something. If I had dreamed about a specific person or a dangerous situation, maybe I could say I had been anxious or imaginative as a child. But why would a 5-year-old repeatedly dream about walking to an unfamiliar house in another part of the world to ask for firewood? Why that house? Why that hill? Why that driveway? Why that exact sequence of events? I have thought about possible explanations. Maybe the place was not as exact as it felt in the moment. Maybe many rural houses look similar. A house in front of a hill with a driveway and a firewood pile is not impossible. It could have been a coincidence, and my memory could have shaped the real place to fit the old dream. Memory is strange. You do not remember dreams perfectly, especially dreams from childhood. You remember the strongest parts, then fill in the rest over time. It is possible that I remembered the house as more exact than it really was because I was shocked by the resemblance. Maybe I had seen a picture of the area somewhere without realizing it. Maybe I had watched a documentary, looked through a magazine, seen a postcard, or passed an image on television as a child. Maybe my brain stored it away and turned it into a recurring dream. Then, years later, when I saw something similar, the old memory surfaced. That is possible, too. But I still cannot shake the feeling that it was more than simple familiarity. The moment I saw the hill and the house, I did not slowly recognize it. It hit me all at once. I knew, before we knocked, before anyone mentioned firewood, before the woman came to the door. I knew exactly what was supposed to happen. And then it happened. That is what has stayed with me. Not because I think I can see the future. I do not. I have never had another dream that played out so clearly in real life. I have never predicted anything important. I do not wake up knowing things that will happen. This was the only time something from a dream seemed to appear years later in such a specific way. Maybe it was only coincidence. Maybe life sometimes puts you in a place that looks so much like an old dream that your mind connects the two and makes the similarities feel impossible. But I remember how ordinary the whole thing was. That makes it harder to dismiss. It was not a moment that should have been memorable to anyone else. It was not a huge turning point. It was just a group of tired campers looking for wood, finding a few houses, and asking a stranger for help. Yet I had been dreaming about it since I was 5. After the trip, I told people about it. Some thought it was interesting. Some probably assumed I was exaggerating. Some said it was déjà vu. Others said dreams can feel prophetic because your brain notices patterns before you consciously understand them. Maybe they are right. I do not know. I only know that there are certain places you visit for the first time and feel like you have been there before. Usually, the feeling fades after a few minutes. But this did not fade. I can still picture the house. I can still picture the hill behind it. I can still picture the driveway and the pile of wood. And I can still remember being 14 years old, standing in a place I had never physically visited before, realizing that some part of me had been there a long time ago, at least in a dream. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, I went sledding with a friend on a very dark winter afternoon. Where I lived, winter days could get dark early. The sky would turn gray before it was even close to evening, and by late afternoon, it often felt like nighttime was already coming. The snow made everything look bright in some places, but the trees, hills, and empty spaces between houses always seemed darker than normal. That day was like that. The sky was heavy and dull, with thick clouds covering most of the light. The snow on the ground had been packed down in places from people walking and sledding, while other parts were still soft and untouched. The air was cold enough to make your face sting, but not cold enough to stop us from wanting to be outside. At that age, snow days and winter afternoons felt like freedom. You did not think much about danger. You thought about finding the steepest hill, seeing who could go the fastest, and trying to stay outside as long as possible, before your hands got too cold. My friend and I had probably been talking about sleds, school, or something unimportant. I do not remember every detail of the day, but I remember the hill. It was one of the better sledding hills in the area. It was steep enough to be exciting, but not so steep that adults would immediately tell kids not to go near it. At the top, you could see down across the snowy slope, and at the bottom, there was enough open space to slow down. There were trees around parts of the hill, but the center was mostly open. It was the kind of place kids naturally gathered during the winter. That afternoon, though, it was not crowded. I do not remember seeing many other people around. Maybe there were a few kids farther away, or maybe we had simply arrived at a quiet time. Either way, it was mostly just me and my friend, our sleds, the cold air, and the long white hill in front of us. At first, everything was normal. We went down the hill a few times, climbed back up, laughed when one of us fell into the snow, and did the usual things kids do when they are outside in winter. My boots kept filling with snow. My gloves were damp. My nose was running from the cold. But none of that mattered because we were having fun. I remember the feeling of climbing back up the hill after a fast ride down. Your legs would burn through your snow pants, your breath would come out in white clouds, and you would be half tired but still excited to do it again. The hill looked different from the top. You could see the tracks made by the sleds, thin lines cutting down through the snow. At some point, we were near the top of the hill, getting ready to go down again. That was when we heard barking. At first, it sounded far away. I do not remember which one of us noticed it first. Maybe my friend looked up. Maybe I heard the noise and turned automatically. But the barking was loud enough that it made both of us stop what we were doing. We looked toward the top of the hill. That was when we saw them. 2 dogs were running toward us. They were huge. Not just large in the way a normal big dog can look big to a child. These dogs seemed enormous. They were black, heavy-looking, and fast. At that age, I could not have told you exactly what breed they were. They may have been some kind of large working dog, hunting dog, or guard dog. But to me, they looked like monsters coming down the hill. Their bodies were low and powerful as they ran. Their mouths were open. They were barking hard. The sound echoed across the snowy hill. I remember seeing their dark shapes against the white snow and feeling panic hit me instantly. There was no slow moment where I tried to figure out whether they were friendly. I did not stop to think that maybe they belonged to someone nearby. All I knew was that 2 giant black dogs were racing straight at us, barking as loud as they could. I turned and started running downhill. I do not even remember making the decision. My body just moved. I grabbed my sled or dropped it. I honestly cannot remember which. I only remember trying to get away from the dogs as fast as I could. Running down a snowy hill is hard enough when you are not scared. Your feet slide, your legs sink, and every step feels unstable. But when you are terrified, you do not care if you fall. You just run. I ran down the hill, slipping and stumbling through the snow. Then I looked back. My friend had not moved. He was still standing there near the top of the hill. He had completely frozen. I could see it in the way he stood. His body was stiff. His arms were close to his sides, and he was staring at the dogs as they got closer. I screamed for him to run. I yelled his name. I told him to follow me. But he did not move. He looked terrified. I had never seen anyone freeze like that before. I knew people could get scared, but I had always assumed that if something dangerous happened, everyone would run. I thought fear automatically made you move, but my friend could not. The dogs were getting closer. I remember looking between him and the dogs, not knowing what to do. Part of me wanted to go back and pull him with me, but I was scared too. I was only 9 or 10. I did not know how to fight off 2 huge dogs. I did not have anything to protect us with. I did not know whether they were going to bite him, knock him down, or turn toward me next. I shouted again, "Run!" Still nothing. The dogs were almost on him. I could hear their barking clearly now. It was not playful barking. It sounded angry, sharp, and loud. Their paws kicked snow behind them as they ran. I remember thinking they were going to reach him before he could even react. Then someone shouted. The voice came from the top of the hill. It was loud, deep, and commanding. I do not remember the exact words. It may have been the dogs' names, or maybe the man yelled for them to stop. But whatever he said, the dogs reacted immediately. They stopped right in front of my friend, not a few feet away, not after running past him, right in front of him. The sudden stop made snow spray around their paws. They were close enough that my friend could have reached out and touched them if he had been able to move. He was still frozen. The dog stood there, barking less now, watching him. Then a man began walking down from the top of the hill. I had not seen him before. That was strange because I had looked toward the top of the hill when I first heard the barking. I had only noticed the dogs. But now there was a man making his way down through the snow, moving carefully but quickly. He looked serious. He was dressed for the weather with heavy boots and winter clothes. I do not remember exactly what he was wearing, only that he looked like an adult who knew what he was doing. He did not seem panicked. He seemed in control. When he reached the dogs, he grabbed both of them by their collars. That was when I realized how large they really were. Even with the man holding them, they looked powerful. Their bodies were tense, and their breath came out in clouds in the cold air. The man asked us if we were okay. I remember nodding because I did not know what else to do. My friend was still shaken. He looked pale and scared, but he was not hurt. The dogs had not bitten him. They had not knocked him down. They had stopped at the last possible moment. The man looked at us for a second, then told us to go home immediately. Not later. Not after one more sled ride. Immediately. His voice made it clear that he was not joking. My friend and I did not argue. We grabbed our things and headed home. I remember walking away quickly, looking back more than once. The man was still standing there with the 2 black dogs, holding them near the top of the hill. They were no longer running at us, but I could still hear them making low sounds. For the rest of the walk home, my friend and I barely talked. We were too scared. The whole thing had happened so fast. 1 minute, we were sledding. The next minute, 2 massive dogs were charging at us. My friend was frozen in terror, and a stranger had appeared from the top of the hill to stop them. At home, I told my mother what happened. I expected her to be angry that I had been out sledding somewhere dangerous. I expected her to tell me I should not have been near dogs I did not know. But when I explained what had happened, she looked more worried than angry. She asked where the man had come from. I told her he had been at the top of the hill with the dogs. She asked whether I recognized him. I did not. She asked whether the dogs had bitten us. They had not. She asked whether the man had said anything else. I told her he had only asked if we were okay, and then told us to go home. At the time, I did not understand why she seemed so concerned. Later, I learned why the man had been there with those dogs. Apparently, he was part of a group of people trying to find a murderer who had reportedly been seen near the area. In our small town, that was a huge deal. People talked about it everywhere. Adults talked in kitchens and on front porches. People mentioned it at stores. Parents warned their children to be careful. Rumors spread fast, especially because the area was small and quiet enough that something like that felt impossible. The idea that a murderer might be nearby made everyone nervous. It was not like living in a city, where you might hear about crimes on the news and feel distant from them. In a small town, when someone says a dangerous person has been seen near your area, it feels close. It feels personal. You start wondering whether they have been near your house, near your school, or near places where children play. The man with the dogs was apparently part of a group searching the area. I do not know if they were official volunteers, local hunters, or just people trying to help look. I do not know whether the dogs were trained for tracking or whether they were simply large dogs that came with him. But the fact that they were on the hill because people were looking for someone dangerous changed the entire memory for me. At the time, I had only thought the dogs were coming after us. Later, I started wondering whether they had smelled something. Maybe they had picked up a scent from the hill. Maybe they were running ahead because they were tracking someone. Maybe they were excited because they were trained to search. Maybe they saw us and simply got worked up because we were nearby. I do not know. But after hearing about the search, the whole thing felt much more frightening. The man had told us to go home immediately because we were kids out in an area where there were rumors of someone dangerous nearby. That made sense. What did not make sense was why my mother had let me go outside in the first place. I do not blame her now because I know adults cannot always protect children from every rumor or danger. And I now know that the criminal had already been caught by the police before the incident happened. But at the time, nobody seemed to know that for sure. The rumors were still spreading. People were still worried. And my friend and I were out sledding on a hill near the woods while a man and 2 giant dogs were walking around searching the area. Even now, when I think about it, I wonder how close we were to something worse. Maybe the man and dogs had only been out there because someone wanted to be cautious. Maybe they were searching after the danger had already passed. Maybe the dogs were simply too excited, and the man had lost control of them for a few seconds. Maybe none of it had anything to do with the murderer at all. But as a kid, I did not know any of that. All I knew was that 2 huge black dogs came running down the hill at us, barking like they wanted to tear us apart. I knew my friend could not move. I knew I was screaming for him to run. And I knew that the dogs stopped just inches from him when a man shouted from the top of the hill. That moment stayed with me more than almost anything else from childhood. The image of my friend standing completely still, the dogs racing down through the snow, the dark sky above us, the white hill beneath our boots, the sound of barking getting louder and louder, then the sudden silence when they stopped. I think about how differently it could have gone. What if the man had been farther away? What if he had not seen us? What if his dogs had not listened? What if my friend had fallen instead of freezing? What if the rumors had been true and the person everyone was looking for had actually been nearby? I do not know. Maybe I was never in real danger. Maybe the dogs only wanted to investigate us. Maybe they were trained and would never have hurt anyone. Maybe the man had control the entire time and knew he could stop them. But when you are 9 or 10 years old, you do not think that way. You only see two huge black animals running at you through the snow. You only hear your friend not responding when you tell him to run. And you only feel the terror of realizing that for a few seconds, there is no adult close enough to help. The man did help us. He got the dogs under control. He made sure we were okay. He told us to go home. I never forgot that. But I also never forgot how quickly a normal winter afternoon turned into one of the scariest moments of my life. Even now, whenever I see two large dogs running toward someone, I think about that hill. I think about the dark winter sky. I think about my friend frozen in place, and I remember the sound of that stranger shouting from above us, just before the dogs stopped. I was about 7 years old when this happened. I was staying at one of my aunt's houses with my family, along with my cousins and siblings. It was supposed to be a normal family visit, the kind of day where adults talked inside while all the kids ran around outside until someone eventually called us in for food. My aunt lived on a property that had a large backyard opening out toward farmland. There was plenty of space to play, and when you were a kid, it felt enormous. There were patches of grass, uneven ground, trees around parts of the property, and open space that seemed to stretch much farther than the yards I was used to. The part of the house I remember most clearly was the massive balcony or raised platform overlooking the backyard. It was high enough that you could stand on it and look down across the whole property. I do not remember exactly how tall it was, but it was far higher than a normal porch. What made it even more dangerous was that it had no railings. There was nothing protecting anyone from walking too close to the edge. Looking back now, I cannot understand how children were allowed near it so easily. But when you are 7 years old, you do not think about falling. You do not look at a high platform and imagine broken bones or death. You see it as another place to play. You see the edge as somewhere exciting to stand because it gives you a better view of everything below. That afternoon, the weather was bright and warm. It was the middle of the day. The sun was high enough that the backyard was fully lit. There were no strange shadows from nighttime. No storm, no rain, no darkness outside. It was one of those clear afternoons where everything should have felt safe. My cousins, my siblings, and I were all playing in the yard. I do not remember exactly what game we were playing. It could have been tag, hide and seek, or one of those made-up games children invent and forget by the next day. I only remember the feeling of running around outside with everyone else, laughing, shouting, and not paying attention to much beyond whatever game we had decided was important. There were people everywhere at first. My cousins were nearby. My siblings were somewhere in the yard. Maybe some of the adults were watching from inside or standing around talking. It was loud in the ordinary way a family gathering is loud. Kids yelling, people calling each other's names, someone laughing, doors opening and closing. Distant voices drifting from inside the house. Then something changed. I do not remember deciding to leave the other kids. I do not remember walking away from them. I do not remember climbing onto the balcony or platform. But somehow, I suddenly found myself alone. I was standing right at the edge of that high platform, looking down into the backyard below. The yard that had been full of people only moments earlier seemed empty. There was no one running around, no one calling my name, no cousins nearby, no siblings standing beside me, no adults looking up. That was the first thing that felt wrong. At 7 years old, you do not always question things clearly. You do not stop and think, how did I get here? Or why is everyone gone? Instead, you feel something change before your mind catches up. I remember looking down from the edge. The ground below seemed farther away than it should have. The grass looked small. The sharp rocks near the base of the platform looked darker against the dirt. I remember feeling uneasy, though I did not know why. Then I felt cold. It was not a normal breeze. The afternoon had been warm, and the sun was still shining brightly. But suddenly, the air around me seemed to drop in temperature. I felt the cold run over my arms and down my back. It was like standing outside on a warm day and having someone open a freezer door behind you. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe someone had come up behind me. Maybe one of my cousins was trying to scare me. Maybe a sibling had snuck up without making a sound. Kids do things like that. They push, joke, grab each other's shoulders, and then run away laughing. But I did not hear anyone. There were no footsteps, no giggling, no voice, nothing. Then I felt a hard push between my shoulder blades. It was strong, not a small bump, not the kind of accidental contact that happens when someone brushes past you. It felt like someone had placed both hands on my back and shoved me forward with purpose. I had no time to catch myself. I had no time to turn around. I had no time to scream. 1 second, I was standing at the edge of the platform. The next, I was falling. I remember the feeling of the ground rushing upward. I remember a sudden rush of air. I remember my stomach dropping in that horrible way it does when you fall unexpectedly. Then, I hit the ground. The impact knocked the breath out of me. For a moment, I could not understand what had happened. Everything felt distant and unreal. My head hurt. My body hurt. The bright afternoon sunlight felt too harsh. I could hear sounds around me, but they seemed far away, muffled as if I were underwater. Then I realized I was bleeding. I had hit a sharp rock when I fell. I do not remember seeing the blood immediately, but I remember the pain and the strange warm feeling around my head. I remember trying to move and not knowing whether I could. I remember being confused, hurt, and terrified all at once. But before anyone found me, I looked back up toward the platform. That was when I saw the figure. At first, it was standing above me. It looked like the shape of a child. Not a normal child standing in sunlight. It was black. Not like someone wearing dark clothes. Not like a person standing in shadow. The figure itself seemed dark, like a solid shadow had taken the shape of a child. The sun was still bright. The platform was still lit by daylight. There should not have been a dark figure standing there. There was nothing behind it to create that kind of shadow. No wall, no tree, no object blocking the light. But it was there. It stood at the edge of the platform, looking down at me. I remember being unable to look away. I was already hurt. I was already scared. I did not understand why I had fallen. But seeing that black shape standing above me made the fear become something else. It was not just fear of being injured. It was fear that I had not fallen by accident. The figure began moving. It did not run. It did not jump down. It somehow came toward me. I do not remember seeing it climb down the normal way. I only remember that suddenly it was close to me. Close enough that I could see its face. It was the face of a child. Or at least, it looked like one. The figure was dark, but the face was clear enough for me to understand what I was looking at. It was staring directly at me, and it looked terrified. It was crying, not loudly, not screaming, just crying in a way that felt full of pain and fear. That was what confused me most. I expected something that pushed me to be angry or cruel. I expected it to look threatening. But the figure did not look happy that I had fallen. It looked scared. It looked like it was suffering. It looked like it had seen something terrible. For a few seconds, it stayed right in front of me. I remember its face being close to mine. I remember feeling like it wanted to say something, but it never spoke. There was no sound, no whisper, no name, no explanation. Only those dark eyes and the expression of fear on its face. Then it turned away. I watched it walk back toward the stairs that led down from the platform. It moved away slowly, still shaped like a child, still dark against the bright afternoon around us. It went toward the stairs. Then it vanished. It did not run into the house. It did not disappear behind a wall. It did not go around a corner where I could no longer see it. It simply was not there anymore. One moment I was watching it move away. The next, there was nothing. Just the stairs, just the bright sun, just the platform above me. I do not know how long I lay there afterward. It may have only been a few minutes, but it felt much longer. I remember being in pain and unable to cry properly. I remember feeling strangely quiet, almost frozen. I was scared, but the fear was so large that I could not even react the way I normally would. Eventually, someone found me. I do not remember who first saw me. It may have been one of my cousins, one of my siblings, or an adult from inside the house. I only remember that suddenly people were around me. Voices became loud. Someone was calling for help. Someone was asking me what happened. Someone was trying to keep me still. My head was covered in blood. I was crying, but silently. That detail has always stayed with me. I was not screaming. I was not panicking loudly. I was just sitting there, hurt and shaking, with tears coming down my face. Maybe I was in shock. Maybe I was too scared to make noise. Maybe some part of me was still watching the stairs, expecting that dark child to come back. The adults did not understand what had happened at first. They probably thought I had climbed too close to the edge and fallen. Maybe they thought I slipped. Maybe they assumed I had been playing too close to the platform and lost my balance. I do not remember whether I told them immediately that I had been pushed. I may have been too young to explain it properly. I may have said someone pushed me, and people may have assumed another child had done it. Or maybe I was too frightened to say anything at all. I only know that I remembered the cold, the hard shove, the fall, and the black child standing over me. I was taken to a doctor. The doctor said I had been very lucky. I had hit a sharp rock, and the injury could have been much worse. I was told later that I had been only centimeters from dying. If I had fallen differently, if my head had hit slightly higher or lower, or if the rock had been in a different position, I might not have survived. At 7 years old, I did not fully understand what that meant. I knew I had gotten hurt badly. I knew people were scared. I knew my parents were upset. But the idea of being close to death was too big for me to process. It felt like something that happened in movies or to other people, not to a kid who had only been playing outside at a family gathering. For years afterward, I remembered the fall. I remembered the platform. I remembered the sensation of being pushed. And I remembered the black figure. But I did not know what it was. I tried to make sense of it as I got older. Maybe another child pushed me and ran away. Maybe I had fallen on my own, and my brain created the feeling of being pushed because I did not remember losing my balance. Maybe I saw a shadow after I hit my head. Maybe I had been injured badly enough that I hallucinated. Those explanations were possible. I know that a head injury can affect memory. I know trauma can make things feel distorted. I know children can misunderstand events, especially when they are scared. But there was one thing I could never explain. The figure looked like a child. Not just any child. A few years ago, I found out something about that platform that I had never known. Another child had fallen from the exact same spot. It happened almost exactly a year before my fall. The child was around my age. They had apparently been in the same area, near the same raised platform, and had fallen in almost the same way. They hit the same sharp rock that I did. But they did not survive. The child died. From what I was told, it happened almost exactly 1 year before I fell, and it happened on that child's birthday. When I first heard that, I did not know how to react. I think I expected the story to make me feel something clear. Fear, sadness, relief, anything. Instead, I just felt numb. Because suddenly, the memory of the black figure did not feel like a random image from a scared child's mind anymore. It felt connected. The timing was too strange. The location was too exact. The rock was the same. The fall was the same. The child was around my age. And then, my parents sent me a picture of the child. I stared at it for a long time. It was the figure I had seen. Or at least, it was the closest thing I had ever seen to it. The face in the picture matched the face that had stood over me after I fell. The dark shadow I remembered had not been clear enough for me to identify at the time, but the features were familiar. The shape of the face, the age, the expression that had seemed so frightened. It was the child who had died there. The child, I believed, had pushed me. That is the part I still do not know how to understand. Why would a dead child push someone from the same place where they died? Was it angry? Was it repeating what happened to it? Was it trying to make me experience the same fall? Or was it trying to warn me somehow? Maybe the push was not meant to kill me. Maybe it was meant to get my attention. Maybe it was trying to show me what happened. But that is hard to believe when the fall nearly killed me. The figure was crying. That is what I keep coming back to. It did not look cruel. It did not look pleased. It looked terrified. It looked like it was trapped in the worst moment of its life. Maybe it did not understand what it was doing. Maybe it did not know I would fall so badly. Maybe whatever happened on that platform had left something behind, something that repeated itself every year or whenever another child stood too close to the edge. I do not know. Maybe I am trying too hard to connect things that should not be connected. Maybe I only saw the picture after years of carrying the memory, and my mind made the face fit because I wanted an answer. Maybe the black figure was only a hallucination caused by pain and shock. Maybe the feeling of being pushed was only my body reacting to a slip or loss of balance. Those explanations are possible. But I remember the cold. I remember the shove. I remember the way it felt like someone was standing directly behind me. And I remember looking up after I hit the ground and seeing a child-shaped shadow watching me from the platform. I remember it coming close to me. I remember its crying face. I remember it turning and walking back toward the stairs before vanishing in the middle of a bright afternoon. For years, I thought the scariest part of the story was how close I came to dying. I thought the scariest part was the blood, the sharp rock, and the fall from a platform with no railings. But finding out about the other child changed everything. Because suddenly, it felt like I had not simply had an accident. It felt like I had stepped into someone else's tragedy. Something had happened there before me. Something had left a mark. And whether it was a ghost, a memory, a coincidence, or a terrified child's imagination, I will never forget the feeling of being pushed from behind by someone I could not see. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. When I was little, somewhere around 3 years old until the beginning of 4th grade, I used to play with something on the wall beside my bed. I called it Mr. Face. It was not a drawing. At least nobody had drawn it there on purpose. It was part of the wall itself, or at least it seemed that way to me. My bedroom walls were painted baby blue, and whatever Mr. Face was had almost the exact same color as the wall. That made it difficult to see most of the time. You could not walk into the room, look at the wall, and immediately notice it. You had to be standing or lying at a certain angle. You had to look at the wall in just the right light. Then, the shape would slowly appear. It was right beside my bed, close enough that I could see it whenever I turned my head toward that side of the room. Sometimes it looked faint, almost like nothing more than a strange pattern in the paint. Other times, especially when the room was dark or the light from outside came in a certain way, it looked much clearer. That was when I could see the face. Even as a small child, I knew it looked creepy. It had two different sides, like two faces had been pressed together into one. One side reminded me of the anonymous mask, with that pale, smooth look and a strange, curved expression. The other side reminded me of one of the Titans from Attack on Titan, especially the parts of their faces that looked stretched and wrong. It was not exactly like either one, but that is the closest comparison I can make now that I am older. The most noticeable thing about it was the smile. Mr. Face had a very wide smile. Not a normal smile. It looked stretched out too far, as if it covered more of the face than it should. The shape of it seemed to pull toward both sides of the wall, like somebody had taken a regular smile and widened it until it became something unsettling. When I was little, it scared me a little, but it also comforted me. That is the part that is hardest to explain. Most people would probably hear about a creepy face appearing on a child's bedroom wall and assume it was something I should have been afraid of. And there were times when I was. Sometimes I would lie in bed at night and look toward it, and the smile would seem wider than I remembered. Sometimes the shadows in my room would make one side of the face look darker, almost like it was staring at me more closely. But I never thought Mr. Face wanted to hurt me. It was creepy. Yes, very creepy. But it was also familiar. When you are little, familiar things can become comforting even when they are strange. Children get attached to odd things. A shadow in a corner. A stuffed animal with one missing eye. A creak in the house that happens every night. A shape in the curtains. A voice from the television in another room. For me, Mr. Face became one of those things. I talked to it all the time. I do not remember every conversation, but I remember talking to it as if it was another person in the room. I would tell it things that happened during the day. I would talk about school. I would tell it when I was upset. I would probably complain about my parents, my siblings, or anything else that seemed important to a small kid. Sometimes I made up games with it. I would ask questions and then pretend I knew the answer. I would stare at it from my bed and imagine that the face had changed slightly. I would look away, then look back, almost expecting it to be in a different position. Sometimes I would cover my eyes for a few seconds, uncover them, and see whether Mr. Face was still there. It always was. At least, whenever I looked from the right angle. I do not know exactly when I first noticed it. Maybe I saw the shape in the paint one night while I was trying to sleep. Maybe I was playing on my bed and noticed that part of the wall looked different from the rest. Maybe sunlight hit the wall in a certain way, and the face suddenly appeared. However it started, I remember that it felt like something I discovered for myself. Nobody had told me about it. Nobody had pointed it out. It was mine. I think that was part of why I became attached to it. Mr. Face was something that existed in my room, beside my bed, where nobody else seemed to notice it. It did not belong to my parents. It did not belong to anyone at school. It was not something adults talked about or explained. It was just there. And because it was always there, I started treating it like a friend. Not exactly a normal friend. Even as a little kid, I knew there was something unsettling about it. I knew it did not look like a friendly cartoon face. It had that strange, stretched smile, and one side of it looked more disturbing than the other. If I saw the same shape somewhere else, like in an abandoned building or on a dark wall outside, it probably would have terrified me. But it was in my room. It was beside my bed. It had been there for so long that it became part of the place where I felt safest. There were nights when I would lie in bed and feel scared of the dark. But then I would look at the wall and see Mr. Face, somehow, that made the room feel less empty. It was like there was someone there with me. That sounds creepy now. Honestly, when I say it out loud, I know it sounds creepy. A child talking to a face in a wall is the kind of story people tell when they are trying to make a haunted house story sound more disturbing. It sounds like the beginning of a movie where everyone ignores the kid until something bad happens. But when I was little, it did not feel like that. Mr. Face was not an enemy. It was just there. Sometimes I would stare at it for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. The face was not always equally visible. On some days, it seemed almost completely gone. I would look at the wall and see nothing but baby blue paint. Then I would shift my position slightly, or lie down on my bed, or look at it from near the doorway, and the shape would come back. The outline of the eyes, the uneven halves of the face, that stretched smile. It was like the wall had a secret hidden inside it. I tried showing it to people. I remember calling someone into my room and pointing at the wall. I would say, "Look, that is Mr. Face." Most of the time, they could not see it. They would look at the wall for a few seconds, then look back at me with that expression adults get when they think a kid is being imaginative. They might say it was just paint. They might say it was a shadow. They might say it looked like nothing at all. That always frustrated me. To me, it was obvious. I could see the face clearly. I could see where the eyes were. I could see the smile. I could see the two different sides, the way one looked almost smooth and masked, like while the other looked more stretched and wrong. But nobody else saw it the way I did. Sometimes I would try harder to explain. I would describe the face. I would point to the exact parts. I would tell people to stand where I was standing, or lie on my bed, or turn their heads slightly. But even then, most people just saw a blue wall. Eventually, I stopped trying so hard. It became one of those things that I knew other people would not understand. I still talk to Mr. Face, though. I talked to it when I was bored. I talked to it when I was upset. I talked to it when I was supposed to be going to sleep, but was not tired yet. Sometimes I imagined it was listening quietly. Sometimes I imagined it was amused by the things I said because of that huge smile. Other times, I thought it looked sad. That depended on the lighting. A shadow could change the shape of the face enough that the smile looked less like a smile and more like something strained or tired. There were moments when I would wake up in the night and see it more clearly than usual. Those were the times that made me nervous. My room would be dark except for a little light from outside. Maybe a car had passed. Maybe moonlight was coming through the curtains. Maybe the hallway light had been left on. I would turn my head toward the wall, and there it would be. Mr. Face, still there, still smiling. The strange thing was that I never remember it moving. It did not blink. It did not talk back. It did not suddenly appear in a different part of the room. It never came off the wall. It was always just a face-shaped pattern that became visible at certain angles. And yet, it felt like more than that when I was a child. That is what makes it difficult to explain now. As I got older, I slowly stopped playing with it. I did not make a clear decision one day to stop talking to Mr. Face. It just happened naturally. I got older, started paying attention to different things, had more schoolwork, more friends, more hobbies, more things on my mind. The face became less important. I still saw it sometimes. I still knew it was there. But I did not spend hours looking at it anymore. I did not talk to it every day. I did not make up games with it. I think part of me started feeling embarrassed about it too. When you get older, you start realizing that other people might think something is weird, even if it feels normal to you. Talking to a creepy face on your wall is not exactly something you mention casually to friends, so I kept it to myself. But I never completely forgot about Mr. Face. Even now, I can picture it. The baby blue wall, the shape that blends into the paint, the uneven face, the huge stretched out smile, the fact that you have to see it from the right angle for it to appear. There is something about the way it blends in that still bothers me. It is not like a poster or a stain where you can point directly at it and say, there it is. It only shows itself when the light and angle are right. That makes it feel like it is hiding, like it does not want to be noticed by everyone. At some point, I moved my bed. Now, my bed is placed in front of the spot where Mr. Face used to be. Because of that, I do not really see it anymore. The wall is partly covered, and I do not lie in the same position I used to when I was younger. I do not stare at that side of the room the way I did as a kid. I do not have the same view of the wall. For a while, I did not think much about it. Then I started wondering whether Mr. Face was still there. The thought comes back to me every now and then. I will be lying in bed or cleaning my room, and I will remember that the wall behind my bed is the same wall where I used to see that face. I will think about the way it used to appear in the baby blue paint. I will remember talking to it when I was little, and then I wonder whether moving the bed is the only reason I cannot see it anymore. Maybe it is still there. Maybe nothing has changed. Maybe if I moved the bed back to where it used to be and looked from the same angle, I would see that stretched smile again. Part of me wants to check. During the summer, I am planning to move the bed back. Not because I want something scary to happen, not because I am trying to prove that my room is haunted. I just want to know. I want to see whether Mr. Face is still on the wall after all these years. I want to know whether it was always some weird pattern in the paint that only my younger brain turned into a face. Maybe there is a crack, a patch of uneven paint, or a shape in the wall texture that happened to look different depending on the angle. That would make sense. Walls can do strange things in low light. Paint can dry unevenly. Shadows can create shapes. A mark that looks like nothing from one part of the room can become a face when you look at it from another. Maybe Mr. Face was never anything more than that. Maybe I was a little kid with a big imagination, and I found a pattern in my wall that became a friend because I needed something familiar at night. But there is another part of me that does not want the logical explanation. That is the strange thing. Mr. Face was creepy, but it was also comforting. It is still comforting in a weird way. When I think about it now, I do not only remember being afraid. I remember the feeling of having someone there when I was alone in my room. I remember talking to the wall and feeling like I was being listened to. I remember that wide smile looking strange, but familiar. Maybe that is why I want to check. Not because I want to prove I saw a ghost. Maybe I just want to see an old childhood friend again. A very creepy childhood friend. There is a part of me that worries about what will happen when I move the bed. What if I do not see anything? That would probably be the normal outcome. I might move everything, stand where I used to stand, turn the lights off, wait for the right angle, and see nothing except a blue wall. Maybe the paint changed over the years. Maybe I only saw the face because my eyes were looking for it. Maybe childhood memory made it seem clearer than it ever really was. But what if I do see it again? What if I move the bed, look at the wall, and Mr. Face is still there exactly as I remember it? The two uneven halves, the eyes, the stretched out smile, the same face that was beside my bed from the time I was 3 years old until I was old enough to stop talking to it. I do not know how I would feel. I think I would be scared, but I also think I would feel relieved. Because no matter how strange it sounds, Mr. Face was part of my childhood. It was there through years of sleeping in that room, being afraid of the dark, being sick, being sad, being bored, and imagining things only little kids understand. It was unsettling. It was creepy. It looked wrong, but it was familiar. And sometimes, the strangest things are the ones that become comforting, simply because they have been with you for so long. I was about 14 or 15 years old when this happened. I was home alone in the living room late at night watching an NBA game. I had always liked sitting on the floor close to the TV. I do not know why exactly. Maybe it made the game feel more intense, like I was closer to the court somehow. Maybe I just found it more comfortable than sitting on the couch. Either way, I was sitting right in front of the television, close enough that the screen filled most of my view. The living room was dark except for the light from the TV. The game was on, the commentators were talking, and the sound of the crowd kept rising and falling in the background. Every now and then, there would be a loud reaction after a shot or a turnover. Then, the noise would settle again. It was one of those late-night games where you are tired, but you do not want to go to bed until it is over. My mom was asleep in her room. The rest of the house was quiet. We lived pretty far out of town, around 30 minutes away from anything that could really be called a neighborhood. There were no houses close by, no nearby kids playing outside, no people walking down the street, no apartments next door where you could hear someone's television or music through the walls. At night, it was extremely quiet there. During the day, the isolation did not bother me much. It was just where we lived. You could see open land, trees, long stretches of road, and darkness beyond the porch light. But at night, especially when everyone else in the house was asleep, the quiet could feel heavy. You would notice every small sound, a branch scraping against the window, the wind moving through trees, an animal somewhere in the yard, a car passing far down the road. Even the house itself made noises that sounded louder at night. The floor would creak, pipes would click, the walls would settle. Normally I could ignore those sounds because they were familiar. But that night I heard something that did not sound familiar at all. I was watching the game when I heard a whistle. It was crystal clear. Not a random high-pitched noise, not wind blowing through something outside, not a bird, not a sound from the TV. It sounded like a person standing outside on the porch to my right, whistling a simple, cheerful tune. The whistle had a rhythm to it. It was not long or complicated, but it was clearly intentional. A few notes, almost playful. A kind of tune somebody might whistle while walking down the street or doing something around the house. What made it worse was that I could hear the breath behind it. It was not just the notes. I could hear the faint human sound between them, the little rush of air that comes from someone breathing in before they whistle again. The second I heard it, I froze. I stopped paying attention to the game completely. For a moment, I did not even look toward the porch. I was too scared to move. My body reacted before my mind could make sense of it. My stomach dropped, my heart started beating faster, and every thought in my head became focused on one thing. Someone was outside. The porch was directly to the right of the living room. There was a window there with curtains drawn over it. The porch light had been left on, so the outside area should have been visible enough to make out anyone standing nearby. If a person was outside the window, I should have seen their shadow. That was the first thing I thought. I slowly turned my head toward the curtain. I expected to see a dark shape standing behind it. I expected to see a person's head, shoulders, or body blocking the porch light. I expected to see movement. I expected to see somebody standing close enough to the window that they could look inside. But there was nothing. The curtain hung completely still. No shadow crossed it. No feet appeared beneath it. No hand touched the glass. No figure moved past the window. I just sat there on the floor, staring at the curtain. The game was still playing behind me. The announcers were talking. The crowd was cheering about something. But all of it sounded far away now. I was not watching the game anymore. I was watching the curtain, waiting for it to move. I remember feeling completely trapped. I did not want to stand up because I thought that movement might make whoever was outside realize I had heard them. I did not want to turn the TV down because the sudden silence would make it obvious that I was listening. I did not want to call my mom because I was afraid she would tell me I was overreacting. At the same time, I did not want to stay where I was. I kept telling myself it had to be something normal. Maybe it was the TV. Maybe one of the players or announcers had whistled, and the sound had seemed like it came from outside because of the way the room was arranged. But I knew it had not come from the television. The whistle had sounded too close. It had come from the right side of the room, directly near the porch. It had sounded like it was just beyond the curtain. Maybe it was wind. But there was no wind strong enough that night to create a tune. And even if wind had passed through a crack or a pipe somehow, it would not have sounded like a person whistling with breath behind every note. Maybe it was an animal. That was possible, I guess. There are animals that can make strange noises. Birds can imitate sounds. Some animals cry, scream, chirp, or make noises that sound almost human. But this was not an animal sound. I knew the difference. It sounded like a human being standing outside and casually whistling. I sat there staring at the curtain for what felt like hours. Realistically, it was probably only a minute. But fear stretches time in a way nothing else does. Every second felt too long. I was waiting for another whistle. I was waiting for a knock. I was waiting for the curtain to move. I was waiting for the porch light to flicker or go out. Nothing happened. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I did it slowly. I remember keeping my eyes on the curtain the entire time. My legs felt weak, and I was trying not to make too much noise. The floor felt cold under my feet. The room felt much bigger than it normally did, like there was too much empty space between me and the window. I took one step, then another. The closer I got to the curtain, the worse the fear became. From across the room, I could still pretend there was nothing out there. But once I was right in front of the window, I would know. I would either see an empty porch or see someone staring back at me. I stood beside the curtain for a few seconds, unable to make myself move it. The TV behind me was still on. The basketball game continued as if nothing was wrong. I remember thinking how stupid the situation felt. There I was, terrified of a curtain in my own living room while a game played in the background. If someone had walked in and seen me, they probably would have laughed, but I could not make myself laugh. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just enough to look through. The porch was empty. The light was on. The steps were empty. The yard beyond the porch looked dark and still. There was no person standing near the window, no one hiding beside the door, no shadow crossing the ground, no car in the driveway that I did not recognize. Nothing. I looked farther out into the darkness. The porch light only reached so far. Beyond the edge of it, everything disappeared into blackness. The trees looked like dark shapes against the darker sky. There could have been anything farther out there, and I would not have been able to see it. That thought made me pull the curtain closed again immediately. I did not go outside. There was no way I was going outside. I did not even want to unlock the door. I did not want to stand on the porch and look around. I did not want to call out and ask if anyone was there. I did not want to give whoever might be outside any reason to know I was afraid. So I went back to the floor and sat down in front of the TV again. I tried to resume watching the game. I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whistle. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I had been so focused on the game that a sound from the TV had confused me. Maybe the house made a weird noise. Maybe I had heard something from far away and my mind turned it into a human whistle. I kept the volume up. I did not want silence. The sound of the game filled the living room, and for a little while, I managed to focus on it again. I watched the players move up and down the court. I listened to the commentators. I tried to pay attention to the score. But I kept looking toward the curtain. Every few seconds, I would glance at it. The porch light still shone through the edges. The curtain never moved. Around 30 minutes passed. I had started to calm down a little. Not completely, but enough that I was starting to feel embarrassed by my own fear. I thought maybe I really had overreacted. I thought maybe I would wake up the next day and laugh about how scared I had been over a sound that probably came from the TV. Then, it happened again. Another whistle. This time, it was different. It was still cheerful, still simple, still clearly human. But the tune was not the same as before. The first whistle had been only a short pattern of notes. This one had a slightly different rhythm, almost like whoever was outside had decided to whistle a new little melody. And again, it sounded like it came from the porch, right outside the curtain. I did not freeze this time. I freaked out. The first whistle had made me unsure. I could still tell myself I had misunderstood it, but hearing it a second time with a different tune removed that possibility. It was not a sound from the TV repeating. It was not a random creak. It was not a bird making the same strange noise. Someone or something was whistling outside. I jumped up and ran to my mom's room. I did not care anymore if she thought I was crazy. I did not care if I woke her up. I did not care if I sounded stupid. I told her there was someone outside on the porch. I told her someone had been whistling at me through the window. I told her I had heard it once, checked the porch, saw nobody, then heard it again 30 minutes later. My mom was scared and confused at the same time. At first, I think she probably assumed I had heard something ordinary. Maybe she thought an animal was in the yard. Maybe she thought I had mistaken something from the TV for a sound outside. But when she saw how frightened I was, she got up. We went through the house together. Every light suddenly seemed too bright. The hallway felt strange. The living room felt different now that I was not alone in it. I remember standing near my mom while she checked the doors and windows. She looked through the front window, then the porch window. She checked the locks. She looked outside. There was no one there. We went around the inside of the house first. Every room was empty. Every door was closed or locked the way it should have been. There was no sign that anyone had come inside. Then we checked outside. I did not want to go, but I stayed close to my mom. The porch light made the front area visible, but only barely. It threw a yellowish circle over the steps and part of the yard. Beyond that, the darkness was thick. We looked around the porch. Nothing we checked near the windows. Nothing we looked toward the driveway. Nothing we looked around the side of the house. Nothing. There were no footprints that we could see. No car. No person hiding behind something. No sign that anyone had been standing near the porch just minutes earlier. My mom eventually told me it was nothing to worry about. She tried to reassure me. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was someone driving past. Maybe the sound had come from somewhere farther away than I thought. Maybe the wind had carried someone's whistle from the road. But that never made sense to me. We lived too far from town. There were no neighbors close enough for someone to be standing outside their own house and have their whistle sound like it was right outside ours. There were no groups of kids walking around at that hour. There were no nearby houses where someone could have been playing a prank. And even if someone had been trying to prank us, why would they choose our porch? Why would they whistle twice, then disappear without making any other sound? Why would they stand in the dark outside a house in the middle of nowhere just to whistle a cheerful tune? I did not sleep much that night. I do not remember whether I stayed in my own room or slept closer to my mom. I only remember lying awake and listening. Every sound outside made me tense. The trees moving in the wind sounded like footsteps. The house settling sounded like someone walking through the hallway. A car passing somewhere far away made me imagine headlights turning into our driveway. And every time the TV noise stopped in my memory, I could hear that whistle again. Clear, cheerful, human. The worst part was how normal it sounded. If the whistle had been strange, distorted, or obviously threatening, I might have been able to explain why it scared me. But it was not. It sounded casual, almost happy. That made it worse. It sounded like someone who was comfortable standing outside our house in the dark. It sounded like someone who knew I was inside. It sounded like someone trying to get my attention without knocking. I thought about whether the person outside could see me through the curtain. The porch light was on, but the living room was also lit by the TV. If someone had been standing near the window, maybe they could see the movement of the screen. Maybe they could see me sitting on the floor. Maybe they knew exactly where I was. That thought made my skin crawl. I kept imagining a face just outside the curtain. I imagined someone standing perfectly still while I sat on the floor watching the game, unaware they were there. I imagined them whistling only after they noticed I was alone. I imagined them leaving the moment my mom came into the room. Nothing ever happened after that night. There were no more whistles that I remember. Nobody came back. There was no sign of someone trying to get inside. No broken lock. No strange car waiting nearby. No explanation from a neighbor. No one admitting they had been outside. It was just those two whistles. I have tried to explain it to myself over the years. Maybe it was a bird. There are birds that can make surprisingly human sounds. Maybe there was some kind of bird in a tree near the porch that copied a whistle. Maybe the tune sounded different the second time because it was not a person at all. But I could hear the breath behind it. That is what I remember most clearly. It was not just the sound that rose and fell like a whistle. It had the little pauses between notes. It had the sound of someone breathing in, then blowing again. Maybe it was an animal that could mimic a whistle better than I realized. Maybe it was the wind moving through something outside in a way that only sounded human because I was scared. Maybe there was a person far away, and the quiet of the countryside carried the sound farther than I expected. All of those things are possible, but none of them feel right. The whistle did not sound far away. It sounded close enough that I expected to see someone's shadow on the curtain. It sounded like it came from directly outside the porch window, and when I looked, there was nobody there. That is what has stayed with me, not the NBA game, not even the fear of a stranger standing outside. It is the feeling of sitting alone in a dark living room, hearing something cheerful and human just a few feet away, then looking toward the window and seeing nothing at all. Even now, if I hear someone whistle outside at night, I think about that porch. I think about the curtain. I think about the light shining outside while the darkness waited beyond it. And I remember the sound of someone whistling a happy little tune where nobody should have been. I was about 17 years old when I went to Japan on a student exchange trip. It was my first time staying so far from home for that long, and everything felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. I was excited, nervous, and trying to take in as much as I could. The food, the language, the streets, the houses, the shops, the trains, and even the smallest everyday routines all felt different from what I was used to. For the first week of the trip, I stayed with a host family in a small town called Hasami in Nagasaki Prefecture. Hasami was quieter than the bigger cities I had imagined when I first thought about Japan. It was not the kind of place where there were huge crowds everywhere or bright city lights outside every window. It was a small town with narrow streets, homes close together in some places, and quieter areas where the night seemed to settle in early. My host family was kind to me. They made me feel welcome, even though there was obviously a language barrier at times. We managed through simple conversations, gestures, smiles, and whatever Japanese or English we each knew. They showed me around, fed me, made sure I had what I needed, and did their best to help me feel comfortable. The house was traditional in some ways, with rooms that did not look like the rooms I was used to back home. Most of the family slept downstairs. I was sleeping by myself on the upper floor. Calling it an entire second floor makes it sound larger than it was. It was not some big upstairs area with lots of bedrooms, long hallways, and open spaces. It was a small, narrow part of the house. When you walked up the stairs, there was a short passageway at the top. On one side of that passage was a window that looked out into a narrow alley. On the other side was a sliding door that led into a traditional Japanese family room. That room was where I slept. It had tatami flooring, and it was simple but comfortable. There was a low table, some basic furniture, and an old television sitting on a TV stand. The TV looked older than anything I had at home. It was one of those bulky sets that seemed like it had been in the house for years, maybe even decades. The remote control sat on top of the TV stand. I noticed it the first day, mostly because I wondered whether the host family still used the television. But I never touched it. I did not know what channels were available, and I was not comfortable turning it on by myself in a house that was not mine. It stayed in the same place every day I was there. Behind the family room was another room, separated by a bamboo-style sliding door. At first, I assumed it was another sleeping room or a small storage area. One day, out of curiosity, I opened the door and looked inside. It was a storeroom. There were piles of things in there: boxes, old household items, blankets, bags, and objects that looked like they had been collected over many years. It was not dirty exactly, but it had that heavy, closed-in feeling that storage rooms often have. The air smelled older in there, like dust, fabric, wood, and things that had not been moved for a long time. As I looked around, I noticed a couple of traditional Japanese dolls. They were inside transparent cases. I know that those dolls are important cultural items, and I do not mean any disrespect toward them at all. But I was 17, alone in a strange house, and already adjusting to a completely different environment. Seeing old dolls in a dim storage room made me uneasy in a way I could not fully explain. They were beautiful in their own way. They had carefully made clothes and detailed faces. But there is something about old dolls, especially dolls sitting silently inside clear cases, that can make a room feel different when you are alone. I did not touch anything. I only looked for a few seconds, then quietly slid the door shut again. After that, I tried not to think much about the storage room. For the first 2 nights, everything was completely fine. The house was quiet at night, but that was normal. The host family would go to bed downstairs, and I would go upstairs to the tatami room. I would lay out my futon, turn off the lights, and try to sleep. Sleeping in a futon was different from sleeping in my own bed, but I got used to it quickly enough. It was actually more comfortable than I expected. The room itself was peaceful during the day. Light came through the window. I could hear small sounds from the house below. Sometimes I could hear people talking downstairs, dishes being moved, or doors sliding open and shut. At night, though, the upper floor felt very separate from the rest of the home. Once I closed the sliding door and the lights were off, I was alone up there. The staircase was just outside. The narrow passage was dark. The window looked out into the alley, and the old television sat only a few feet away from where I slept. The futon was placed around 5 feet from the TV stand. I could see the dark shape of the screen from my bedding whenever I opened my eyes. During the day, it was just an old TV. At night, when the room was dark, the blank screen seemed larger. It reflected faint shapes from the window and bits of light from outside. But otherwise, it was only a black rectangle facing the room. I was not particularly frightened at first. I was tired after long days of travel and student activities. I had plenty to think about. I was focused on being polite to my host family, learning new things, and enjoying the trip. Still, the upper floor had a certain atmosphere at night. The house made sounds. Wood creaked. Something in the walls would occasionally click. Wind would brush against the outside of the building. Sometimes I could hear distant sounds from the alley through the window. A bicycle passing. Someone walking. A vehicle moving farther down the road. The quiet hum of a town settling down for the night. I told myself that all of it was normal. Then came the third night. It was cold outside. I remember that clearly because winter had settled in, and the air in the upper floor felt colder than the rest of the house. I had my futon pulled around me and was trying to get comfortable enough to sleep. The room was dark, the television was off, and the only light came faintly through the window. I do not remember the exact time, but it was around 12:30 in the morning. I had not been fully asleep yet. I was in that uncomfortable stage where your body is tired, your eyes are closed, but your mind is still aware of every small sound around you. That was when I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was a vehicle. The sound came from the direction of the alley, somewhere near the window. It sounded like wheels rolling over hard ground, but it was not the smooth sound of a car. It was rougher and slower. It sounded like someone pushing a warehouse trolley, the kind of trolley with heavy things loaded onto it. I could hear the uneven roll of the wheels, followed by a faint rattling sound. It seemed like something metal was moving over pavement or concrete. Every few seconds, there was a small clunk, as if the wheels were catching on cracks in the ground. The sound was not extremely loud. But in the silence of that upper floor, it stood out. I opened my eyes. For a moment, I just listened. The window was on the other side of the narrow passage, and I could not see directly outside from where I was lying. I would have had to get up, go through the sliding door, step into the hallway, and look out. I did not feel like doing that. I was tired, and there was nothing especially impossible about someone moving something through an alley late at night. Maybe a person was taking out rubbish. Maybe someone was delivering goods early. Maybe the sound was coming from farther away than it seemed. I remember thinking that it was weird, but not terrifying. Not yet. The rolling sound continued for a little longer. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was immediate. No footsteps, no voices, no more rattling wheels, just nothing. I lay there for a few seconds, listening. Then I closed my eyes again. That was when the television switched on. The sound hit first. A sudden blast of static filled the room. It was loud enough to make me sit up immediately. The screen came to life with that blurred gray-white snow effect that old televisions used to show when they were on a channel with no signal. The room flashed with flickering light. The static sound was harsh and constant, filling the quiet space in a way that made it feel much louder than it probably was. For a second, I could not move. I stared at the TV. The screen was bright. The static rolled across it in waves. The sound crackled through the room. And I knew I had not turned it on. I had never touched the remote control. I had never used that television. The remote was still on the stand where it had been since I arrived. I had noticed it every day because it never moved. Nobody had come upstairs to use the TV while I was there. Nothing strange had happened during the first 2 nights. But now, the television was on. At around 12:30 in the morning, right after the sound outside stopped, the 17-year-old version of me completely panicked. I did not sit there trying to find a reasonable explanation. I did not inspect the remote. I did not check the buttons on the television. I did not think about power surges, wiring problems, or old electronics. I just wanted the thing off. I jumped out of the futon, moved across the tatami floor, and unplugged the entire television from the outlet. Not just turned it off, unplugged it. The static stopped immediately. The screen went black. The room became quiet again. I remember standing there for a moment, still holding the plug, staring at the dark screen. The silence felt wrong after the static. A second earlier, the room had been filled with noise and flashing light. Now it was completely dark again, except for the faint glow coming through the window. I looked toward the sliding door. I looked toward the hallway. I thought about the alley outside. I thought about the sound of the trolley. And I thought about the storeroom behind the bamboo sliding door. I did not want to think about the dolls, but my mind went there anyway. I remembered the transparent cases. I remembered the quiet, dusty room. I remembered how the dolls' faces had looked in the low light. I knew it was probably irrational. I knew there was no logical reason to connect an old television, turning on to some dolls in a storage room. But when you were 17, sleeping alone in a strange house in another country, with an unfamiliar room behind you and no one else on your floor, your brain does not always choose the calmest explanation. I stood there for a while, trying to decide whether I should go downstairs and wake someone. Part of me wanted to. I wanted to tell my host family that their television had turned on by itself. I wanted to ask if something was wrong with it. I wanted to know whether the sound outside was normal. I wanted another person nearby. But I was embarrassed. I did not want to disturb them in the middle of the night over something that might have a simple explanation. I was a guest in their home. I did not want to seem rude, dramatic, or childish, and I had no way to explain the situation easily. Even if I woke them up, I would have to try to describe the rolling sound outside, the TV static, and the fact that I had unplugged their television because it scared me. So I decided not to say anything. I plugged nothing back in. I left the TV unplugged. Then I went back to the futon. I lay down again, but I did not sleep well. Every small sound in the house became more noticeable. A creak from downstairs made me tense. The wind near the alley made me open my eyes. The pipes making a faint noise in the wall sounded louder than they should have. I kept expecting the television to turn back on, even though I had unplugged it. I knew it could not. But when you are scared, logic does not always calm you down. You can know something is impossible and still wait for it to happen. I kept looking toward the TV stand. The screen stayed dark. The room stayed quiet. Nothing else happened that night. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I woke up with that strange feeling you get after a bad night when you are not sure whether something truly happened or whether you dreamed it. For a few seconds, I wondered if I had imagined the entire thing. Then, I saw the unplugged cable. The television was still disconnected from the wall. The remote control was still on the TV stand. Everything was exactly where it had been. I plugged the television back in later, during the daytime. I did not turn it on right away. I just plugged it back in because I felt strange leaving a host family's TV unplugged without saying anything. I expected it to start showing static again the moment it had power, but it did not. It stayed off. Normal, silent, nothing else happened with it. I did not tell my host family about what had happened. I considered asking them whether the TV had electrical problems, but I never found the right moment. Every time I thought about bringing it up, it sounded silly in my head. Your TV turned itself on after I heard something outside. I did not want to say that. Maybe they would have explained that the television had a timer. Maybe the remote was faulty. Maybe the old TV had a loose connection. Maybe there had been a power interruption. Maybe they would have looked confused and thought I was making it up. So I kept it to myself. I stayed in that house for a few more days before moving to another host family's place. Nothing else happened. The TV did not turn on by itself again. I never heard the trolley sound outside again. I never saw anything in the alley. The dolls remained in their cases in the storeroom, exactly where I had seen them before. I avoided opening that sliding door again unless I had a reason to. During the rest of my stay, I still felt uneasy when I went upstairs at night. I would notice the television sitting there. I would notice the passageway outside the room. I would hear the soft sounds of the house and wonder whether something would happen again. But it never did. Years later, when I told people about the experience, most of them had the same reaction. They said it was probably an electrical problem. They said old televisions can turn on by themselves. They said maybe the remote had a stuck button, or the TV had some kind of timer setting, or there was a power issue that caused it to switch on. They also said the trolley sound probably had nothing to do with it. Maybe somebody really was pushing something through the alley. Maybe a neighbor was moving supplies. Maybe there was a delivery or a business nearby. Maybe it was just a coincidence that the sound stopped right before the TV came on. And honestly, they could be right. That is the most reasonable explanation. An old TV can have a fault. A remote can malfunction. Electrical systems can behave strangely. And people move things around late at night for normal reasons. The part that still bothers me is the timing. The rolling sound stopped. I closed my eyes. And the television switched itself on with static. It happened so quickly after one another that it felt connected, even if it probably was not. It is also possible that I was already more nervous than I realized because of the storage room. Seeing the traditional dolls had unsettled me. I do not think the dolls were evil. I do not think they caused anything. I know they were just objects that belonged to the family and probably had personal or cultural meaning. But I was a teenager in a strange place. I was alone on the upper floor. I had already seen those dolls sitting in their transparent cases among old stored belongings. Then I heard something moving outside, in the dark. Then an old television suddenly filled the room with static. Of course I panicked. Maybe the dolls did not cause the fear. Maybe they only gave my mind something frightening to focus on afterward. Even now, I cannot say that anything supernatural happened. I cannot say the house was haunted. I cannot say the sound outside was connected to the television. There may have been a perfectly ordinary reason for every part of it. But I still remember the room. I remember the cold winter air. I remember lying in the futon, trying to sleep. I remember the sound of wheels rolling slowly through the alley. I remember the silence after they stopped. And I remember opening my eyes to see the old TV glowing in the dark, its screen full of static, as if somebody had turned it on just to make sure I was awake. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.